"The past is prologue," wrote William Shakespeare. And looking at the map of existing and planned transport corridors crisscrossing Eurasia, this observation becomes strikingly clear. Since ancient times, the Middle East has served as a crucial link between the Western and Eastern worlds. It was through this region that the famous Silk Road ran, an extensive network of trade routes along which caravans journeyed from China to Europe. Centuries later, the Middle East's importance has not only endured, but has actually grown. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 provided the shortest maritime route connecting Europe with East Asia. Moreover, the rising importance of oil and natural gas has made Middle Eastern states among the world's largest exporters of energy resources. And so the Middle East's strategic significance has made it one of the most important theaters of geopolitical competition in the 21st century, a rivalry that is defining new trends in geopolitics. Contrary to established patterns, we are witnessing here not only competition between major powers, like the United States and China, but also among numerous middle players, such as India and Turkey. The rivalry itself is waged not so much through tanks, warships and aircraft, but rather through tankers, container ships and pipelines. This ongoing competition is best illustrated by the multitude of infrastructure projects that individual players are promoting. Alongside China's Belt and Road Initiative, we also have the India-Middle East-Europe corridor, backed by America and the EU, which aims to challenge Chinese ambitions in the region. Meanwhile, Turkey is developing its own project under the banner of the so-called Middle Corridor. Russia too has its ambitions, and following its invasion of Ukraine, has intensified work on the so-called North-South Corridor. Last year, even Baghdad joined this infrastructure race, presenting the Development Road Project, which would make Iraq the primary intermediary in trade between the Persian Gulf and Europe. All these initiatives, though they differ in scale, direction and political backing, share a common goal: to seize control over the new trade routes of the 21st century, and thereby gain influence over global flows of goods, raw materials and technology. The Middle East, as in centuries past, is once again becoming an arena where the interests of global politics and economics intersect. This time, however, the stakes are much higher than in the past, and the race involves not only the American hegemon and Chinese challenger, but also a range of middle players who want to leverage emerging infrastructure projects to dominate the region. Let's see how. Just as nations compete for Middle Eastern trade routes, there is another battle for control happening right now over your personal data. Data brokers make billions selling your information to marketers, scammers, even stalkers. While they must remove your data if asked, they deliberately make it confusing. This is where today's sponsor, Aura, comes in handy. While we discuss nations competing for trade routes, Aura protects your digital pathways. They automatically remove your info from broker sites and keep it off. But Aura does much more. It is complete digital security in one app. Dark web monitoring for your personal info, real-time fraud alerts for credit and banking, 24/7 identity monitoring, VPN, antivirus and password manager, plus $5 million identity theft insurance, and US-based support available 24/7. Just as Middle Eastern corridors shape global trade, data brokers shape your digital life. Don't leave yourself vulnerable. Click the link in the description and try Aura for free for 14 days. In 2 weeks, you will see exactly where your data is exposed and take back control. September 7th, 2013 can symbolically be considered the starting date of contemporary competition over transport corridors in the Middle East. On that day, speaking at Nazarbayev University in Astana, Chinese President Xi Jinping outlined the general framework of the Belt and Road Initiative, a project that, according to his words, was to become the new Silk Road. Both land and maritime branches of the new Silk Road were to pass through the Middle East. The land connection was to run through Iran and Turkey, as well as Kazakhstan and Russia. The maritime connection was to pass through the port of Gwadar in Pakistan and through the Suez Canal. However, in the case of the Middle East, the Belt and Road Initiative was never strictly focused on creating a west-east transit corridor. Instead, China was primarily concerned with securing the Middle East as a base for energy resources that would fuel the Chinese economy. Hard data best demonstrates how important the Middle East is for China's energy needs. China is the world's largest importer of crude oil and liquefied natural gas. Approximately 55% of oil and about 25% of LNG imported by China comes from the Middle East. In the 12 years since the inauguration of the Belt and Road Initiative, China's economic relations with the Middle East have intensified enormously. The value of trade between China and the region's countries has doubled, while in the case of Gulf Cooperation Council (GCC), it has increased more than threefold. At the same time, China has become the main trading partner of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, as well as the largest foreign investor in the Middle East. Although Chinese activities in the Middle East still do not pose a direct threat to the American security structure in the region, Washington is viewing Beijing's successive moves with growing suspicion. Particularly dangerous for the United States is the rapid strengthening of ties between China and the wealthy Gulf monarchies, which could at some point threaten America's regional position. This is especially significant given that it is precisely the Gulf countries, alongside Israel, that underpin American power projection in the Middle East. Washington's concerns about its position in the region are reflected in the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, or IMEC, which is intended to become a direct competitor to the Middle Eastern component of the Belt and Road Initiative. The India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, IMEC, was first presented publicly in September 2023, when during the G20 summit in New Delhi, representatives of the United States, India, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, France, Germany, Italy, and the European Union signed a memorandum on establishing the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor. The name IMEC can be somewhat misleading, as it suggests one cohesive route. However, the memorandum stipulates that IMEC consists de facto of two interconnected transport corridors. The first, the so-called Western Corridor, proposes transporting goods from India to Gulf ports by sea. Then at Gulf ports, goods would be transferred from ships to trains, which would continue overland transport through Saudi Arabia and Jordan to Israel. There, at Israeli ports, cargo would again be loaded onto ships and set off on their journey via the so-called Northern Corridor to Europe. IMEC, however, is not just about transporting goods. The memorandum provides that accompanying infrastructure will be built along the railway line, enabling the transmission of electricity as well as hydrogen. The signatories of the IMEC were to meet within 60 days of signing the memorandum to develop a detailed action plan and work schedule. This meeting, however, never took place. Less than a month after signing the memorandum, Hamas attacked Israel, and the entire Middle East region became the arena of an Israeli-Iranian confrontation that continues to this day. Such a situation obviously does not serve the construction of the transport corridor. This doesn't mean, however, that the IMEC project has been completely abandoned. The memorandum signatories still place enormous hopes in the project and want to return to the topic once the situation in the region stabilizes. In theory, IMEC is a project perfectly tailored to the ambitions of each signatory. From the US perspective, IMEC is a blow aimed at China's Belt and Road Initiative. But not only that, IMEC is also an opportunity for rapid rapprochement between Israel and Saudi Arabia and for bringing the Saudis into the Abraham Accords, which American diplomats are intensively pursuing. From India's perspective, IMEC fits perfectly into the rivalry between New Delhi and Beijing, and into the Link West policy initiated by Prime Minister Modi, under which India wants to build close relations with Gulf countries that satisfy about 40% of India's oil demand and about 50% of its gas needs. For the European Union, IMEC represents an opportunity for new opening with countries of the so-called Global South, relations with which Brussels has begun to attach particular importance in recent years, especially after Russia's attack on Ukraine. The leaders of Saudi Arabia and the UAE also view IMEC positively, seeing enormous economic benefits in the project, as well as their own positioning as a strategic bridge between West and East. Therefore, in theory, IMEC appears almost like an ideal project. The devil, however, is in the details. IMEC assumes bypassing the Suez Canal, which is supposed to reduce transport time for goods between India and Europe by 40% and lower costs by about 25%. However, by bypassing one choke point, IMEC becomes hostage to another bottleneck, the Strait of Hormuz, which ships sailing from India to ports in Saudi Arabia and the UAE would have to navigate. Meanwhile, the Islamic Republic of Iran, located on the other side of the Strait of Hormuz, sees the IMEC project with great suspicion. Iranians fear that India's involvement in the new initiative will completely bury plans for expanding the port in Chabahar. As early as 2003, India and Iran signed an agreement for joint development of this port. Iran was to gain a modern ocean port east of the Strait of Hormuz. India, meanwhile, was to receive an ideal base for trade with Central Asian countries. More than 20 years later, work in Chabahar is still at a preliminary stage. The main culprit for this state of affairs is American sanctions. It is no wonder then that Iran fears IMEC could be the final nail in the coffin for the Chabahar port. Turkey also has its reservations about IMEC. President Erdogan, who also was at the 2023 G20 summit when the IMEC memorandum was signed, summarized the project in a few sharp words. "We say there is no corridor without Turkey. The most convenient line for traffic from east to west has to pass through Turkey," said the Turkish president. Such a sharp reaction is no coincidence. Turkey has aspired for years to the role of Middle East leader, including when it comes to connectivity. IMEC, however, represents direct competition for two infrastructure projects that are key to Turkey, namely the Middle Corridor, implemented in cooperation with China and Central Asian countries, and the Development Road, implemented jointly with Iraq. The Middle Corridor, or more precisely the Trans-Caspian International Transport Route connecting Turkey with China, is often mistakenly reduced to the role of merely one branch of China's Belt and Road Initiative. This is an oversimplification. The Middle Corridor is actually an older project, and its role is not limited to transiting goods from China to Turkey and further west. The history of the Middle Corridor dates back to 1998, when the presidents of Turkey, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan and Georgia signed a joint declaration in Ankara on the need to create a corridor that would allow for the transport of oil and gas from Central Asia to Turkey, and subsequently the export of these energy resources to the European market. Within the framework of the Middle Corridor, a series of strategic energy infrastructure projects have been implemented. The Baku-Supsa pipeline, which transports oil from Azerbaijan to Georgia, and the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan and the Baku-Tbilisi-Erzurum pipelines, which transport oil and gas from Azerbaijan to Turkey. The Middle Corridor has also expanded beyond the rigid framework of energy cooperation and is constantly being extended with new components. This includes, among other things, the expansion of rail transport and ports on the Caspian Sea, as well as the creation of free trade zones. After Xi Jinping announced the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, the Middle Corridor began to be considered in the context of the Chinese project. This is where the shortest route from China to Europe runs. It is not only an alternative to the maritime route running through Suez, but also to the Northern Corridor, the overland connection running through Russia and Belarus. In the context of the Belt and Road Initiative, the Middle Corridor begins in China, where goods are loaded onto trains and sent west. The trains then head to the border with Kazakhstan and then via one of two routes, through Dostyk or Altynkol, reach the Caspian Sea coast. There goods are loaded onto ships and sent to the port of Baku. After reaching Azerbaijan, cargo is again transferred to trains, which are directed to ports in Georgia and Turkey. From there, goods, by ships or rail, finally reach Europe. The downside of this route is the necessity of multiple transfer of goods from trains to ships, differences in rail gauges in individual countries, and the lack of several key rail connections, such as the China-Kyrgyzstan-Uzbekistan line. All this increases costs and extends transport time. As a result, despite the fact that the Middle Corridor is in theory the shortest route from China to Europe, in practice, transporting goods this way is 4 times longer and 2 times more expensive than the competing Northern Corridor. Consequently, for many years Beijing did not pay much attention to the Middle Corridor. But China's perspective changed after Russia's attack on Ukraine. It was then that Beijing began searching for an alternative connection to Europe that could bypass sanctions-hit Russia. Additionally, the Middle Corridor gained geopolitical significance. Russia, engaged in Ukraine, is unable to effectively defend its influence in Central Asia. Investment in the Middle Corridor thus appears as an ideal opportunity to expand Chinese influence in Russia's soft underbelly. After Russia's attack on Ukraine, interest in the project also increased from Brussels, which wants to establish closer relations with Central Asia and curtail Russian influence, as well as check potential Chinese expansion in this part of the world. Brussels recognized the Middle Corridor as one of the priorities of the EU's Global Gateway strategy, under which it wants to invest about 300 billion euros in various infrastructure projects worldwide by 2027. And yet another perspective is that of Ankara, which sees the Middle Corridor as an opportunity to transform Turkey into a major transport hub on the west-east axis. However, the Turks are not only concerned with economic benefits. The Middle Corridor and its connection to the Belt and Road Initiative fit into Ankara's broader policy of balancing between China, the USA, and Europe. After all, the Middle Corridor is also a very important tool in realizing Turkish ambitions regarding Central Asia, where Ankara promotes the political and economic integration of the Turkic world. Turkey's vision as a strategic transport hub is reinforced by yet another project, the Development Road, implemented in cooperation with Iraq. In April 2024, during President Erdogan's visit to Baghdad, a 4-party memorandum of the Development Road was signed. This project envisages building nearly 1,200 kilometers of railway and highway that would connect the Iraqi port of Al-Faw with Turkey. Upon completion of the project, the port of Al-Faw would become the largest port in the Persian Gulf, capable of simultaneously servicing as many as 90 ships. Very importantly, among the signatories of the Development Road Memorandum, alongside Turkey and Iraq, were also Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. It is precisely these two countries that are to largely finance this ambitious project. While Qatar's involvement as a close ally of Turkey is not surprising, the UAE's involvement, at first glance, may cause some surprise. After all, the Emirates are also party to IMEC, and thus a project competing with the Development Road. However, the Emirates view this matter more broadly, seeing in the Development Road an opportunity to free Iraq from the influence of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Moreover, the Development Road could bring enormous economic benefits to the Emirates, as Iraq wants the Emirati company DP World, which already handles about 10% of global container transport, to be involved in managing the port of Al-Faw. The Development Road is a very ambitious project that could redraw the map of the Middle East. However, its implementation is still a long way off, as the planned completion date is not until 2050. Still, China and the United States are not the only non-Middle Eastern players engaged in the corridor wars being fought in the Middle East. We also have Russia, which, after its invasion of Ukraine, has set to work with redoubled force on the International North-South Transport Corridor, or ENSTC. We discussed the ENSTC concept in our 2023 video. In fact, the project has its origins in the 19th century British-Russian rivalry for influence in Central Asia, known as the Great Game. The concept was revived in 2002 when Russia, Iran and India signed an agreement to build the North-South Corridor, a multimodal trade route connecting Russia with India and the Indian Ocean. The route would begin at the Indian port of Mumbai, from where goods would reach Iranian ports on the Persian Gulf, then be transported north by rail and through Azerbaijan or the Caspian Sea reach Russia. It is estimated that transporting goods from India to Russia using ENSTC could be about 30% cheaper and 40% faster than using the competing route through the Suez Canal. Initially, work on ENSTC proceeded very slowly, but in 2022 it suddenly accelerated. This was all due Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the Western sanctions imposed on the Russian economy. ENSTC proved to be an ideal alternative for Russia, desperately seeking trade routes bypassing Europe and Suez. Since 2022, the volume of trade passing through the North-South corridor has been systematically growing by about 20% each year. However, the future of the ENSTC is in serious doubt. India's engagement in IMEC and the Development Road and Middle Corridor project, promoted by Turkey, could significantly limit ENSTC's potential. This is especially true given that Russia and Iran are subject to severe sanctions, which makes it more difficult to attract foreign investors. For years, reports about American-Chinese rivalry have dominated all geopolitical discussions, and every important event on the international arena is considered precisely through the prism of this rivalry. This is also the case with competing infrastructure projects in the Middle East. Here too, the temptation arises to assess this war over trade corridors through the lens of US-China rivalry. After all, we have China's Belt and Road Initiative and the quote American IMEC initiative. Such thinking, however, is a trap that oversimplifies much more complicated processes. With the twilight of the unipolar world and the return to the logic of multipolar order, the greatest change that is occurring is not so much American-Chinese rivalry, but rather the enormous increase in importance of second-tier countries, or the so-called middle powers, which, without taking an unambiguous position in US-China rivalry, are able to maximize their geopolitical gains. This can be seen clearly in the example of competing transport corridors in the Middle East and the policy of the United Arab Emirates. The Emirates are an important US ally, have joined the Abraham Accords, and are signatories to the IMEC memorandum. At the same time, however, the Emirates are a member of BRICS and support China's Belt and Road Initiative. As if that weren't enough, the Emirates are engaging in the Turkish-Iraqi Development Road project, which competes with the IMEC. Such behavior by the Emirates may seem internally contradictory, or simply absurd. Still, this is exactly how middle players behave in the realities of a multipolar world. They don't align themselves with any party, preferring to keep their options open. It is precisely from the perspective of these middle players that the corridor wars currently taking place in the Middle East should be analyzed. This is not only a clash of great powers, China and the United States, but also a game in which middle-tier states, such as the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Turkey and India, actively shape the course of events. It is precisely these middle players who will gain the most from the corridor wars. And in this way, the Middle East today becomes a laboratory of multipolarism, a space where the rules of the new global order are fully applied, but based not on unipolar dominance, but on the dynamic interplay of interests of many middle-tier actors.